right, so it looks like everyone has food. Everyone's happy and kind of like relaxing a little bit. We have a really special treat today. I just want to make sure you're in the right, you're in the right space. The title of our talk today is Educational Inequality in School Finance: Why Money Matters for American Students, which is also the title of our speaker, Bruce Baker, of his new book. Came out 2018, Harvard Education Press. So you can check that out if you'd like. And specifically, Professor Baker is going to be talking about implications for Connecticut and Latinx communities as well as Connecticut. So like I said, this is a special treat. Bruce Baker is a professor in the Department of Educational Theory, Policy, and Administration at the Rutgers Graduate School of Ed, and is widely recognized as a leading scholar in the field of education finance. And this kind of happened serendipitously. Bruce has been on Twitter talking all sorts of stuff about Connecticut. What's going on in Connecticut? And so finally he was in Connecticut, and I said, well, why don't you come over to Trinity College in Hartford and talk a little bit about what you're finding in the data, and tell us a little bit of like a story of what's happening with educational funding in the state. Bruce was also a expert witness for the CJEF versus Laurel case. Didn't work out exactly how folks had hoped, but he's kind of like he kind of has expertise and understanding of kind of the lay of the land for Connecticut. Also, just like one quick thing that I want to say is like we have a really kind of quietly distinguished group of visitors. First of all, you guys is a beautiful group. But we have some like really cool people that are here that I want to just recognize really quickly. First of all, I wanted to recognize my counterparts. I'm the director of urban initiatives here in this Center for Hartford Engagement and Research. This is also the house of the Center for Urban and Global Studies. Our director for Urban and Global Studies is Garth Myers there in the back. Okay, so he's here. Our director of communications for Share, Erica Crowley's back there getting a little bite to eat.
Thank you.
Megan Hartline, the director of community learning, is here. They helped me to put this together, this event today. And we also have some really some distinguished folks. We have State Representative Brandon McGee, who's also here representing Hartford and Windsor, correct? Hartford and Windsor. You see it right there. And we also have the former Commissioner of Education in Connecticut here, Dr. Diana Wetzell. She's right here. So thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you for serving Connecticut. And we have plenty of other folks too. I could kind of go on and on and on. I don't want to just note those people. All right, so we got about 30-45 minutes. Excuse me. I was logging with 30-45 minutes of Bruce's talk. Then we'll open it up to questions first with students and community folks, and then if like the adults and professionals would like to ask questions after that, you can ask questions too. All right. So without further ado, Dr. Bruce Baker.
What just happened, I was driving through and I DM'd Rob and was asking about things going on, and he said, hey, why don't we do a lunch talk? Sounds like a really cool idea. So here I am. Let's have a little fun with this. I got way more stuff than I could ever possibly use. I want to make sure that I get to the Connecticut slides so we can focus a bit on that. I've been studying Connecticut for years. I've been involved in issues pertaining to Connecticut school funding and other things in Connecticut for a really long time. Just a quick backdrop here. I did a master's at UConn at Psych, Gifted and Talented, where actually I spent most of my time touring around with the jazz ensemble, and I got a really good review of my friend. Fiery Alpha Saxophone by Bruce Baker. Also good where Gary Versace went on to actually be a pretty well-known jazz pianist. The first paper I ever wrote in my doctoral program at Teachers College, we got to choose a state to write about for school funding. I wrote about Connecticut school finance in the 1990s. And I frequently conspire with anyone who knows Preston Green over at UConn. He and I write a lot about charter school law, definitions around publicness, privateness, and kind of third-party arrangements that tend to conceal certain financial transactions. We do not have enough time to get into that today. But there are a whole bunch of fun articles about that. And I testified in the CJEF case. So I've been on this Connecticut thing for a while. There are not as many Connecticut examples in my book. Other states kind of, I think, got a more prominent role. The themes in the book, this is the shameless sales pitch part. The graphic up there to keep. money matters. I'm guessing most of the people in this room realize that how much money you have for schools actually affects the quality of schooling that you can provide. The really interesting thing is that, we've had all this talk for years about magical substitutions or solutions for how we could just make schools more efficient, do more with less, new normal, technology here and there, most of which have really just been additive costs. The reality is that running a good school takes having good people and enough of them. And to get good people in, you got to pay well enough. You got to have competitive compensation. You got to have enough people with the right qualifications to get the job done. It's about working with kids, helping kids learn things, meet goals, and achieve in the short and the long term. And it's a human resource intensive process for which we have not found magical substitutes, be it kids in cubicles or kids with tablets or whatever. We've not found those cheaper solutions. And one need only look at other sectors. What do charter schools do? One of the differences is adding more days and hours with teachers that on average are younger, so the average salaries are lower, but they tend to get paid 30 to 50% more for the experience and degree levels they have for working the 30 to 50% more time. In the high-profile charter management organizations that have on average, they're the ones that in the research have produced the outcomes. So even in charter schooling, it's about smaller classes, better paid people have the same credentials, and longer days and longer years. It's human resource intensive. And private schools, you get the elite private schools around, what do you see? You see class sizes. In fact, one of the standard models is the Hartness table, which I often blog about. 12 kids around an oak table having an interactive conversation where the reason for the oak table is not to even have the teacher in some kind of central lecturing role. They're a participant, someone who's mapping the interactions in the process. Very human resource intensive, and that's why the elite private schools on average spend double per pupil what public districts in their same area spend, based on a study I did a number of years ago. It's just the way it is. Spending hasn't grown out of control for decades. I got some slides on this coming up. A lot of people say spending's gone up and up. Test scores have stayed flat. That's one of the standard money doesn't matter arguments. I've got pages and pages of debunking that in the book. Won't go through all of that now. School spending varies substantially across states and in some states, especially across districts within states. And Connecticut is one of those states where there are these huge inequities. Inequities to the point where I have this list in my head around the country of which districts are really left out. And these districts, it's gotten to the point it's kind of sad. The district names roll off my tongue. I could talk about Pennsylvania and the position of Reading and Allentown and Hazleton or Chicago and places like Waukegan, the places you don't hear of. It's not Chicago and Philly. Philly and Chicago are in tough shape too. And in Connecticut, talk about Bridgeport, Waterbury, and Britain, King, and New London. Not New London, sorry, New London, Denver. Spending varies widely. Some of the core principles that we lay out in a new national report, this is cool. There are all these different organizations that have been doing national reports on school funding for years. Urban Institute does one now. Education Trust has their funding gap reports. And the only organization that has not jumped on board with agreeing on the principles and indicators is Education Week and their quality counts, and it turns out that the quality counts indicators don't relate to any of the other indicators. And it's very frustrating because people point to those as somehow meaningful or useful. I get asked about them on the stand. Well, the Ed Week gave us a B. How can that be bad? And I have to explain why their indicators don't align with anything else. But proper funding is a necessary condition. It's a basic condition. Whether you're running a public, private, or a charter school, you've got to have enough money to get the job done. The cost of providing a given level of educational quality varies by context. Small rural communities may take more. It may take more to get the same outcomes in settings with higher poverty concentrations. It may take more to get the same outcomes where labor costs are higher. There is a standard basket of factors that we explore in school funding that have to be considered when we target money. One of the basic principles that flows from this is, at the very least, when we look at a state school funding system, districts that serve higher need student populations need not just the same, but more to strive for common outcome goals. And ever since we adopted federal policies like No Child Left Behind, we've really put the pressure on states to adopt systems for setting standard outcome goals, and then we've designed state accountability systems around rewarding or penalizing districts based on whether or not they're meeting these common outcome goals. But we've not thoroughly redesigned our state school funding formulas to ensure that schools and districts have the resources that would be needed for kids to have equal opportunity to achieve a common outcome goal. It takes more money, not just the same money, in a district that's high in poverty concentration, high in concentrations of English language learners, if you want to strive for a common outcome goal. It takes a progressively funded system. The other thing that we've not always considered well, and I was hammering this point home the other day in DC to a group of administrators, was that if we want to set higher outcome goals, it costs more to achieve more. It's like the mantra I tried to give them. It costs more to achieve higher outcome goals than to achieve lower ones. And so we have to consider that higher outcomes cost more and that certain student populations with special needs cost more. Adequacy and fairness of education funding are largely a result of legislative choices. That, yeah, and I've talked mainly in recent lectures about interstate variation, that some states, yeah, we have wealthier states and poorer states, and states with more fiscal capacity can spend more on their schools than those that don't have the capacity. But it's also very much about whether or not the states choose to spend on education or not. Now in Connecticut, across districts, you have some of the same issue, that wealthier communities are able to spend more. It's a little less of an issue. Most communities that lack the capacity would like to have the capacity to spend more. But there is a weird twist in states like Connecticut that have municipal fiscal dependence, where the school district's budget is dependent upon the city budget, as in Bridgeport, where sometimes you'll see that the municipality refuses to put forth the effort that even they could put up to fund their schools. It's less that way when you don't have municipal fiscal dependence, but you still have that drive in communities that are less directly invested in their schools. Larger proportions of the population are senior citizens or not with school-age children enrolled in the schools, where they won't put forth the effort. But the bigger differences there are across states. States like Arizona and Colorado have simply thrown their education systems under the bus. They've systematically declined their effort toward funding schools for the last several decades. A couple of other core concepts here. We used to strive for just getting to equal dollar inputs. In fact, even that would be a step in the right direction in Connecticut. You'd be able to get Bridgeport, Waterbury, and New Britain up to equal dollar inputs. But that doesn't necessarily even get you to the next step. But even if you have the same amount of dollars, some labor markets, it's going to cost you more to get the same quality teachers and other staff in remote rural settings in western Kansas. I was a professor at the University of Kansas for 11 years. It may take quite a bit just to staff a tiny school, that be able to have the additional, have the support staff, have a librarian, nurse, administration. In addition to the biggest cost is actually the basic underlying class sizes of running a school district with less than 300 or less than 100 kids. Connecticut doesn't have as much of that, though Eastern Connecticut is its own world compared to, or even Northwestern Connecticut, its own world compared to the Hartford Metro or the Gold Coast. Equal opportunity and equal opportunity to achieve adequate outcomes are where we typically move in most of the conversations about what is a constitutionally adequate system in a state. And the equal opportunity is that kids across settings, across schools, based on their different needs and the settings in which they're educated, should be provided equal opportunity to achieve the common outcome goal, however high or low that outcome goal is set. So this can operate independent of setting what that outcome goal is. That there should be equal opportunity to achieve the outcome goal, which means, on the one hand, making sure that we could cover that competitive wage differential from one place to another in the state, or the economies of scale, the remote, sparse, rural difference in cost, but also the fact that we would need to provide not just the same, but more staff, and maybe more specialized staff in a school that has greater student needs. We might need smaller class sizes and additional support staff, be able to hire multilingual teachers with smaller class sizes in a place like New Britain as opposed to in a place like New Canaan or Darien or Greenwich. So we've got to be able to leverage those, hire kind of more and more thoroughly trained people, which drives the costs up. And we got to have a formula that accommodates that. Adequacy is just when we jump to setting a bar, when we decide, well, this level of outcome that we're shooting for is an outcome that all kids should be able to attain, whether it's what an appellate division in New York State decided in the early 2000s that, well, they got to be at least sufficiently informed and to be able to read at a level so they can be an active civic participant at the level of kind of voting in general elections, which was interpreted as being roughly an 8th grade education, or whether it's something higher, is a meaningful high school education, which was considered to be higher than the 8th grade education in the New York State rulings. Do we have an operative, Wendy, being our Connecticut legal expert, and New York for that matter, do we have an operative phrase on that for what the standard is in Connecticut?
After CEJA?
Yeah.
Well, CEJA Supreme Court, I would say, set one of the lowest bars ever, which is basically, they said, they really didn't look at everybody choosing adequate outcomes. They just said, on average, you have barely adequate or minimally adequate buildings, teachers, and instrumentalities of learning, and that's it. And on average,
so it's a minimum adequacy real resources standard more than anything.
Exactly.
Square footage,
and in fact, they shied
yeah.
away from any qualitative, and they've consistently since 2010 shied away from any qualitative in terms of outcome. But the Supreme Court, over the objection of Justice Palmer, who set the 2010 standard, but they essentially said that anything like services for ELL, students who are learning English, or any other kinds of social support services are all extra.
See,
so
the thing
anything
is,
beyond the bare minimum is extra.
So that keeps you here. It's because the real basis, and this is how we move theoretically in this field which I've become immersed in, from here to here and here, is that the reason those services exist is to provide those kids with equal opportunity to get to the same outcome goal. Like the reason we might want to have smaller class sizes in higher poverty communities, the reason we provide supplemental services for ELLs, the reason we provide special education services is to equalize the probability that these kids can hit that outcome we're mandating. Right? Without this, you don't have the basis for those other than to somehow say, well, we're doing something input, but why are you offering different input toward achieving, at least probabilistically? It's not that we're saying, No Child Left Behind articulates that all children shall hit that mark. This framework, from a statistician's standpoint, is that at the very least we ought to be setting up a system that disrupts the relationship statistically between where you come from and who you are and how far you get. Right? That probabilistically, if you come from New Britain and nobody's speaking, English as a first language in your home, and your housing is disrupted on 3-month cycles for inability to be able to pay rent, and you're reshuffling from one location to another, that we ought to be able to provide the additional services that are necessary to help your kids be as likely as any other kid in the state to succeed down the line. And that gets expensive. But that's what provides for equal opportunity. It's when we set the bar of what that should be that we start talking about adequacy. Yeah?
I want to interrupt you just for 1 minute because you said something that is incredibly important, is the high transiency rate among low-income children. I've been trying in the state to raise that issue for 3 years, but these low-income kids are moving all the time, and they eventually give up, and no one's addressing it.
Well, I think, and maybe we can have a solutions-oriented chat after this. I think there are things districts can do on that, and maybe states can enforce as policies on ensuring that when there is that mid-year inter-district mobility, that the districts have ways to support keeping the kids in the same school if they've moved from school zone to school zone within the district or in the same district throughout the school. If we can find model policies for school districts and support funding, because it also may alter the transportation. Right? If the parents are then themselves unable to provide the transportation to keep the kid back in, because that's a piece of the puzzle. The transiency, the language issues, these are huge. We've got to find the policies, the mechanisms, and the funding to disrupt the relationship, to make sure those kids have the same chance.
The military has a good program, and it's working for, especially for black males.
That's it, yeah. It's just one rule. All right. So, money matters, myths. I'm not going to roll, because I want to hit, especially, I'm going to just touch on these. There are some standard things that are thrown out there as explanations for why money doesn't matter. There's one, they'll show you a scatter plot that shows, money and test scores and say, hey, look, no relationship. Or Rick Hanishek, one of my favorite opponents to go out. He threw a whole bunch of those up there for Connecticut. Long-term trend, everyone, Betsy DeVos tweeted this one out one day. Money went up, test scores stayed flat. These are not legitimate research about whether or not money matters. There's a whole bunch of legitimate research about that. It is shameless sales pitch. It's summarized in the book. Some of that summary is, and then there's this, we spend more than any other country ever has on Earth, and maybe even other planets, and we get nothing for it. Jimmy said, yeah, I didn't go that far. He's actually a research fellow at Johns Hopkins. And I was like, are you kidding me? And I actually have a whole separate paper, but it's in the book also explaining why, when the spending comparisons are flawed between countries, but there are other issues involved. So I'm going to skip over this is that standard graph that you often see. This is the Betsy DeVos version of it. I dread what it was like being a staffer within the Department of Education who was asked to construct this graph on her behalf. Because I'm guessing the staffer knew full well that they were being asked to construct something that's entirely invalid. And that's got to be, maybe they quit the next day. I don't know. I know plenty of people who have quit the next day from the current Department of Ed after being asked to do similar tasks, but others who are writing it out, working at home in New Jersey, hoping to make it through. Kirabo Jackson, who's an exceptional scholar on this stuff, points out that, well, if we buy the logic behind this graph, then we have to buy this logic. And, well, as female smoking rates have gone down, it turns out the rates of death from lung cancer among females have still gone up. This type of analysis really doesn't tell us much about it. He also points out that if we rescale these data and we take them through the recession period, you actually can see a leveling of the test scores as the funding starts being cut. And then they did a more rigorous analysis to show that there were these detrimental effects of the recessionary cuts on student outcomes. After doing richer, longer analysis, it showed that the infusions of funding that occurred in earlier decades really led to positive short-term and long-term outcomes, especially for kids from impoverished backgrounds. So, stuff matters. So yeah, this is a quick summary slide. Recent school finance studies, Kirabo Jackson goes by the name Bo Jackson. And then LaFortune, Rothstein, and Candelaria and Shores have done a number of studies. The reason these studies are coming out now isn't just because we've come to this new revelation, or it's that we have more data available. We have these national data sets that are now available for 20 plus years, and you can really tease out change over time much better than we ever could before. And we have a site, schoolfinancedata.org, where we have a compiled panel of 27 years of data on every district in the country, including a whole bunch of census data and school finance data and stuff that you can use for this type of analysis. There are a number of studies on state-specific school finance reforms that have shown positive effects, including in Massachusetts and Vermont, Kansas, and Michigan, and a recent one in California that showed longitudinally as money was infused in Massachusetts. It was under the MERA Act in the 1990s. Massachusetts Education Reform Act. There was an infusion of money late 90s through the early 2000s, which substantially positively affected student outcomes. Massachusetts since then has fallen back significantly on that, and Massachusetts has its own subset of districts that are significantly left out on the school funding side, and Merton and as a group recently filed a case against the state. This includes places like New Bedford, Chelsea, Everett, Lowell, Springfield. Quick run of these actual long-term cycles before I try to jump to the Connecticut stuff. First of all, this is the top line is unadjusted current spending per pupil. The bottom line is if we adjusted for changes in labor costs over time, not changes in a CPI, a consumer price index, because the cost of running a school is not dependent upon the cost of the fluctuation in the price of a loaf of bread or a gallon of gas. The cost of running a school is dependent upon being able to recruit and retain teachers, employees of the same quality tomorrow that you could today, which means keeping wages on track with similarly educated professionals. It's an opportunity costing. Well, am I going to go into teaching or something else, and how big is the gap? This isn't about closing that. It's about maintenance of the gap that already is, which is the teachers for the same hours per week and weeks per year are at about 88%. At the same degree level and age, are at about 88% of other workers with bachelor's and master's degrees. So holding that constant over time would have had. So when we adjust for that, we find that even now, national average, we're below, well, this is by 2017, which is the most recent of the federal data, still below the pre-recession levels. And we're really not too different from 1993. So, but remember, it costs more to achieve more. Have we changed the outcome goals? It costs more to achieve more in terms of achieving a higher standard or having to do more things, meet many different things. If we're shooting for more, it's going to cost us more, but we're spending the same in unadjusted dollars. And there's a little bit of fun here in terms of the percent of economic capacity spent on schools. This is where we're at in 2017, about 3.8%. We were at about the same level in 1986 when Top Gun was the top grossing movie. And Deanna and Friends, That's What Friends Are For was the number one song. I was asked to sing it in the last session when I did on Monday, but I declined. I used to tear into that one though back in the day. So we're not, and since the recession, you can see that as the economy has grown, we've just basically let the percent of economic capacity that we spend on schools decline. We haven't kicked it back up. We said, well, there's never any good time to really increase the amount that we're spending on schools. Even in staffing, we often hear people talking about, well, we just put more and more staff into schools. Right? Staffing did escalate in the 90s. Staffing ratios per 100 kids escalated in the 1990s. And that had to do with, we were starting to add a lot more things that schools had to do with testing, assessment, and all of that across states. It's kind of in the run-up to No Child Left Behind. It was also the time period where we were starting to finally get a handle on the provision of federal statutorily compliant special education programs and services and staffing ratios. So the special education staff, the administrative layers for managing, monitoring special education, and the development of assessment systems led to an uptick in staffing through the early 2000s, but we're still only at, we bumped up a little bit more by the pre-recession period on staff per pupil. So this is numbers of instruction staff per 100 pupils. But we're back down to where we were in 2003 when Finding Nemo came out. And I would posit that, even since then we're there. This is this kind of ties in with the teacher pay revolts of the past year. That teacher pay as a percent, actually by Sylvia Allegretto's estimates, teachers on average are only at 77% of the weekly wage of similarly educated non-teachers. They were at their peak during the golden era when All for One and Boys to Men were tearing up the charts. And in ER, Friends, and My So-Called Life were the top 3 TV. That's when teachers had it at their best. That's when they were at 88.5% of the wage of similarly educated, same-age non-teachers. Again, as others, and I have these little economic periods in here to point out that when the economy, when the economy tanks and other wages dip, yeah, teachers may catch up a little bit, but when the economy gets better, they don't hold steady, they fall back behind. And every time the economy gets better, the teachers fall further behind in the mix. Because we don't tend to invest our returns in this. Little run at interstate variation here. There's huge variation across states, but I'm thinking I got to probably fly over to the Connecticut stuff pretty quickly. Well, yeah. So let me get there. State, quick run at this. Connecticut is, in terms of the percent of its either gross state product or personal income spent on schools, Connecticut is in the lower half, but it's because Connecticut is still a relatively wealthy state. It's a high capacity state. Doesn't spend a lot of its capacity on schools, but still on average, this is state and local together, still on average has relatively high average spending. Right, so it's relatively high average spending, but I want to note a comment that a judge in Kansas once said about that. And that high average spending is also associated with the fact that on average, Connecticut kids do pretty well. One of the international reports that showed that Connecticut kids compared to other countries stack up pretty well. Kansas judge in a school funding case once pointed out, he said, well, the state in their defense has suggested that most Kansas children are doing just fine, which is true in Kansas also. And then the judge goes on to say, but this case is about the rest of them. It's those disparities. Yeah, the average is fine. The average spending is fine. The effort rate is low. We got room for more effort in Connecticut. But still able to generate relatively high spending. This is the relationship between how much effort states put up and how much they spend. Connecticut's up there. New Jersey, this is actually the wealth and spending. So Connecticut's high wealth, high spending. New Jersey, Massachusetts up there with them. Connecticut's lower effort, but still high spending. New Jersey's higher effort. Vermont is the highest percent of economic capacity spent on school. That's because Vermont doesn't have as much capacity. That's where I grew up in Vermont. Vermont doesn't have the same kind of economic engines that states with more of the urban centers and other industry have. Skip over these. Skip this national education cost model stuff for now. I want to point out one of the ways that Connecticut came back into my radar in recent years is I've been doing these. I did this report for the Center for American Progress back in 2014. Originally, it started as a blog post. If anyone's followed my blog for years, it was called America's Most Screwed School Districts. And I wanted to do something that was, I'd been doing these studies of funding progressiveness to try to map, on average, to the higher poverty districts in a state have the same or more or less than the lower poverty districts. It was good if the line tilted upward, that higher poverty had more. And it was at least not the worst if it was flat, and it was pretty terrible if it was negative, like Illinois and Pennsylvania. Connecticut was getting, at the time, Connecticut still had an upward tilt. Now it's actually moved to a downward tilt. The upward tilt in Connecticut was largely a function of the magnet funding driven to Hartford and New Haven. But even at that time, Bridgeport, Waterbury, and New Britain were left out of the mix. So I had to find a way to start talking about how am I going to point out their districts that are left out here. So I started doing this supplement to my report called America's Most Screwed Districts, where I would look at, well, which districts have much higher poverty than everyone around them in their same metro or in their same labor market, yet lower funding. Because just at face value, without any complicated statistical modeling or anything, that's just wrong. If you've got twice the poverty and 80% of the spent money per pupil spending, that's not going to cut it. Because at twice the poverty, you need more, not just the same, and certainly not less. And that's what this says. And I would do these runs every year, and I would try to look for the ones where the biggest gaps were between your poverty ratio and your revenue ratio to your surroundings. And this is from the 2017 data. I ran it the biggest gap in the country is New Britain. Lowell, Mass gets in there. Reading is always right up there. Bridgeport's in there. Waterbury's in here somewhere. And so Allentown. It's the same districts every year. Around here, Waukegan might be on this list. St. Louis City, yeah, Waukegan's there. So year after year in these national reports, I was finding. Maybe once to take the sunshine, we can bring it back up. And then there were still pundits who were out there saying, well, Philly gets lots of money. This guy was on the state board. He was actually chair of the state board in Maryland, who went off on a rant about how Philly got all this money one day on Twitter. And I was like, wait a second. This is Philly's relative spending and revenue per people with the red line. This is the average for their labor market, and that's their poverty. Philly has never once even achieved the average per people spending for their labor market, and has consistently had double or more the poverty rate of their labor market. Don't ever tell me that we've poured money into Philadelphia. Guy said the same, actually one of his friends said the same thing about Reading in a whole lengthy piece. Chicago, same thing. In fact, I believe Arnie Duncan himself once talked about the money poured into Chicago. Chicago is among the two major cities that are most shorted on funding. Reading, Allentown, Schenectady, New York is in the middle. And then Bridgeport, New Britain, and Waterbury. And the interesting, so I updated this to the 2017 data. These are tailing off. It's getting even worse. It held steady.
I'm going to push back. It's getting better.
Yeah.
The state has fixed its education funding problem. This coming fiscal year is now the second year in a row where it's actually funding the formula based on the formula without politics. So New Britain, Bridgeport, and Waterbury are all getting more funding, and at the same time the state's shifting funding from overfunded towns to underfunded.
My guess is what I'll see in the next 2 years of data is a slight uptick.
Yeah,
Very slight uptick.
It's a 10-year phase-in,
Which,
but the
lucky if it
change,
makes it beyond year
the
3.
change to an actual funding system over a payment list, Orlando's right, is a huge improvement that the legislature deserves a lot of credit for, because there's a lot of small towns that fought the progressive group in the legislature that got that done.
The thing is, I mean, we may see an uptick, right? But the trick is, I mean, you're talking about like a 10-foot deep hole that we just threw one shovelful into, and we've promised to throw 20 more shovels full in over the next 10 years. Let's see where we.
they're getting a lot of money.
Well, we'll have to see its impact on the per pupil expenditures over the next couple of years, because that's really the tricky, because especially when you start looking at the numbers just in the aggregate, how many $1 million or tens of millions or whatever, then those numbers all look big because they got lots of zeros. So skeptically, I want to see how that plays out. I want to see how long it's also great legislatures. So, it's good that they're willing to try to promise what subsequent legislatures will do. Things change pretty quickly.
You also have to worry in
fingers crossed.
Connecticut because we have a problem here that while the state spends more, then the towns will spend less.
Well, right,
And
that's
so
the
there's no change.
municipal fiscal dependence problem too, without having a hard minimum, and that's one of my recommendations. I mean, you got to have a hard minimum on the local contribution so that doesn't happen, right? That they're not just taking it as tax relief. And it's a bigger issue in the municipal fiscal dependence model. Another thing I found, and this gets us into the issue of the Latinx communities, is in the national report that I did back in 2014 for Center for American Progress, I found that one of the strongest predictors of who are these disadvantaged communities, what's the common characteristic of Reading, Pennsylvania, Waukegan, Illinois, and New Britain, Connecticut. These are Latinx communities in second cities in the States. And statistically, it has been borne out that one of the strongest predictors, if I control for other factors, on average, districts that have higher percent black population, it's not that they have enough money, but their funding is slightly greater than the average of districts with lower percent black, but percent Hispanic has strong negative effects. or percent Latinx communities, strong negative effects. And it probabilistically, it was like the strongest predictor of being a screwed district, being in these second cities that are predominantly Latinx. And we can kind of go on with different kind of political explanations, economic explanations, housing structure and tax base explanations. I mean, there's some fun demography behind it too, about children per housing unit and tax base per pupil as local source revenue generating, just because of the way different populations will use the same housing unit structure. Like if New Britain, it's my understanding, if you go back 40, 50 years, predominantly Italian middle class community, where I would envision different housing structure use. And even if the tax base itself did not shift dramatically, if you have more children per housing unit, your tax base per pupil is lower and generates less. And I did that analysis on places like Reading and Waukegan to find that's what, I mean, it's not, I mean, it's just different preferences, different uses for space. And a lot of these were, and actually rural ag communities like Lexington, Nebraska and Dodge City, where you had kind of two elderly white folk living in a house, which was then subdivided and had two families with 5 kids living in the same house. But the funding formulas have not adapted and accommodated these shifts, right? And there are there's substantial differences. I mean, it's probably trying to pin like Latinx communities. There's substantial differences in New Jersey with the way recent Ecuadorian immigrant communities occupy housing in the cities and unions versus multi-generational Cuban or Puerto Rican. So, and we got to tease that out a lot more, but still somehow present a unified front on this disparity in funding. So rolling through here, Connecticut. Just a quick run of Connecticut per pupil spending stuff over time. For a while, the highest poverty districts, this is adjusted for labor costs. It did tick up in the 2000s and then went flat through the recession, but the highest poverty districts went from first to last in the mix, breaking them out by quintiles. Over that period of time, the highest poverty districts slid from first to last. Just a quick run at this. And state aid had some pretty sharp cuts during the recession. Has kind of bounced back, but not enough to offset those losses. While the lower poverty districts have just continued to climb in their local and are predominantly dependent on local, not so much on state. We have this progressiveness indicator, which is what's the ratio of spending in high poverty to low poverty districts. And Connecticut, with that magnet funding infusion, had reached a point where the high poverty districts on current spending per pupil were at 30% above the low poverty districts. It was mostly a Hartford and New Haven thing. This basically the school funding fairness indicators. By 2011 or 12, they were back to neutral. And by the most recent year of data, 2017, we're now with high poverty districts having only about 90% of the revenue or spending or staffing ratios of the low poverty districts. Demography has continued to shift in Connecticut. You guys know this probably better than I do, right? Demography has shifted. White population has declined steadily over time. Latinx population has increased. As the second population, black population has stayed relatively constant. Bridgeport, Waterbury, and New Britain have been persistently screwed over time, and it's continued to get worse. And maybe we'll see an uptick. Got my fingers crossed that I see some tick. You see, there are little periods in there where it ticks back up, where we could probably trace those back to some short-run infusion of funding, something that may have gone on right before the recession toward New Britain, like 6, 7, and 8. 2006, New Britain it falls down by about 6 and then ticks back up a little. Does the same happen in Waterbury at the time? Yeah, so there's a little uptick in Waterbury does some catching up in that same period. Maybe there was some infusion at that time. That is about the kind of tick I would pessimistically expect with this most recent change, about that much catch-up. Now, it would be cool if they kept going from that, like if they had kept going from that trajectory, that would have been cool. But they didn't. They got what happened is they get to 2008 and the economy tanks. Now, this is all relative, so when some other districts around them kind of got hurt too, so they actually caught up a little more as a function of that. But we'll have to see how this next infusion plays out. The other thing that we see, this is kind of the map of percent Hispanic against the ratio of state and local revenue to labor market average. And the higher you go on percent Hispanic, the lower you get. And it's especially these, well, also Wyndham, New Britain, Denver, Waterbury. East Hartford has moved itself further and further over year after year. There's room. One, we know that Connecticut's relatively low on the effort side. We also know that Connecticut's got a regressive overall tax system. There's room to tax at the higher end to start digging out of these holes. Whether there's political will is a totally separate question. But right, you've got to, the average rate of cumulative state and local taxation as a percent of family income is relatively high compared to even Massachusetts or New Jersey. The problem is the tilt of that. Massachusetts and Connecticut are much more regressive than is New Jersey in terms of the distribution of taxation. So, devastating ruling, the road ahead. There's room for the taxation. Political will, I don't know. We got it. There's this issue of municipal fiscal dependence, but even more broadly, where you don't have that, you've got to have on the local contribution. You got to have a hard minimum, or else you get that tendency to try to just take tax relief. And I actually, in that original Center for American Progress paper, have an illustration of how that had played out in Bridgeport over the years, leading to that being one of the major factors in why Bridgeport was as screwed as it was, were the municipal budgeting decisions on behalf of the school district. You also need a funding formula that is legitimately calibrated around equal opportunity and adequacy goals. And to his credit, the lower court judge had in his head, in the CJEP case, this concept that, it should somehow be linked to these differences. The problem is, in doing so, he established a standard that the higher court chose to say was not based on precedent. We can have a lengthy discussion. So, and a lot of states have these formulas that they did in late, like pre-recession. New Jersey and a number of other states calibrated formulas around meeting certain outcome goals. But we changed the outcome goals. When you change I'll close saying it one more time. Higher outcomes cost more to achieve. Probably way more talking than I should have done. We can chat it up from there.
Thank you, Bruce. I wanted to open it up to any questions from any of our students or any community members first, and then we can maybe open it up to a little bit of broader discussion. So, any Trinity students, community folks, want to launch a question?
Yeah, more of a comment than a question. Thank you for your presentation. Absolutely amazing. I'm also appreciative of you looking through the lenses of equity, making sure that we sort of raise the argument we need to spend a little bit more in order to do more in these school districts where, otherwise they're not starting at an equal sort of playing field. We're way down here, right? And you also talked about the importance of looking at the whole sort of student district, and not only just education, but other resources that help to make the career of our children successful. But what I did hear, and selfishly, this is my question as a representative of Hartford, you didn't talk about sort of the impacts of the Chef v. O'Neill case on our school system, the overall sort of culture, on how we spend money, how we manage all of these different school options. From your perspective, share with me, you know, I'm a policymaker. Where do we go from here when you have this case being discussed in back rooms and then they throw it over to us to figure it out? Help me process through that, and perhaps even the folks here.
It's because, of course, Chef in its own Connecticut context is still this like end run on getting around the constraint that Milliken threw on us decades before, right? But there's, I mean, the big problem, you know, Connecticut is a really exaggerated example of it, as is, you know, New Jersey, you know, is that we've got this incredible degree of racial and socioeconomic and ethnic, you know, segregation across district lines, right? And I did a piece with Preston actually looking, like, it's interesting, I mean, people will look at the magnet school program offered as remedy to Chef in a positive light. It's an expensive solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed but for Milliken, right? We're like backed into spending way more than we had to try and allocating it toward these magnet schools to try to bring in kids from suburban neighborhoods, to try to create an integration where there were these boundaries that, you know, based on Milliken v. Bradley, could not be overcome by the federal court system. And then we get criticized for having such an expensive solution. Now, the state of Connecticut helped to fund that expensive solution for a number of years, and now it's, you know, because that's tapered off, that's back on the district, but you're still stuck with the expensive model for doing it. It's years, a couple of decades, not even, it was only about a decade before that, not quite, that, you know, Kansas City and the federal district court judge there, who designed a very similar program, was just much maligned in national media for proposing such a crazy, expensive program for solving segregation and improving student outcomes in Kansas City. Preston Green and I wrote a lengthy article explaining how the judge was just trying to be creative within ridiculous constraints. The ridiculous constraint being Milliken v. Bradley.
I want to give a chance for maybe one or two other folks to have a question. Any other folks in the audience?
I have one.
I could go on and on that topic. We can do a little side conversation.
Sami's a
Trinity
Trinity student.
So one of the things that kind of like I got curious, I guess, is because I know how even though there are magnet schools are very segregated, and then when you're measuring the outcome and the success rate, I don't know. I thought that it was kind of missing some sort of graph that we show, because it's hard to see the average as a definite result, and I felt like having like the difference between the highest and the lowest scoring as a way of like better understanding instead of just the average. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, well, that's the key. I mean, averages always conceal the disparities. We've got to concern ourselves with the disparities. Right, there's only so much I can throw up here, but yeah, and we've got to concern ourselves with, right, it's really disrupting that relationship between, again, where you come from and who you are, and the likelihood that you can get to this bar, and then being able to look at those, and ideally looking at those disparities at the level of the student. Have we given every student the opportunity to get to this point, realizing that students are still going to get to different points, but you shouldn't be getting to a lower point only because you started from a lower point.
Other question? I think this will probably be maybe one or two questions. We got here. I'm not sure what your name is.
Oh, hi, I'm Sandra. I'm a
Sandra.
Trinity student.
And then we'll go with Alicia.
My question was just about like spending in terms of like where would it go? Like would it just go to increasing the salaries of teachers? Would it go to increase like exactly where would it go? Because if it goes to just increasing the spending for career pathways, let's just say that people would stop after just getting certain certifications and things of that nature. So like making sure you're like getting a good impact with the increase of money spent with it?
Within that, you can break it into two parts. Within the K-12 system, we do find that it's Kirbo Jackson's study where he showed that money led to better student short-term outcomes and then even life income and college matriculation and completion. He showed that these infusions of money in the past led to those positive outcomes, but then he looked and saw that, well, the way the money was spent in K-12 schools was to hire more people and pay better wages. You have more and better, when you have smaller class sizes and you have better paid to bring people into the profession. Over the long haul, that makes for better schools. And separately, we got to look at, and I've been doing a piece on infrastructure in Arizona. We do have to look at the investment in infrastructure, equalizing the quality of the physical spaces in which kids learn, and also the community spaces and play spaces and outdoor spaces in which kids interact. But then we got to go the next step now too. And this is like a one-sentence thing at the end of my book, but it's also a second book that I now have with the Century Foundation. We got to look at how to make more accessible public two-year colleges eventually for you. We got to make sure that, I don't know if anyone's read Sarah Goldrick-Rab's book, Paying the Price, but it's an absolute, read it before you bother to read mine, but it's a book about understanding all of the costs associated with pursuing higher education and the fact that it's become a necessity to be able to succeed in our world today, just to be able to get by in many cases. Yet, even if we subsidize tuition, we may not be covering all the fees. We aren't covering the fact that people have to live and eat. And so, looking at the costs of higher ed, I have a piece out that explains, how can we better understand the full costs of providing free community college, and then how can we build structures into policy to ensure that we're financing it. How can we take this from K-12, well, we added pre-K, right? We got it to pre-K-12 in a lot of states. Pre-K. Can we get it to 14? So all well and good to give these kids equal opportunity to get to good benchmarks at grade 12, but if they then get out and they're like, well, how the hell am I going to afford even a two-year college? Or, I can pay the tuition, or I can get scholarship for the tuition, but I got no place to live. And maybe you're 7 or 8 years out of high school and you don't have family supports or anything, and you're on your own and trying to do that. We got to look at the next step.
Alicia, did you have a question? Last one, I think.
Sure. Well, thanks for giving me that question. So, I'm from outside Chicago, so when you said Waukegan, I was like, whoa. So, I have a couple of friends that live around there, and I don't know if you're familiar with Grays Lake High School, but
No.
it's like the neighborhood like right next to Waukegan. And it's interesting because I have friends that live in Round Lake, but there's a tiny little pocket of
Round
them
Lake's
that...
another disadvantaged community, though, right?
Yes, so they live in Round Lake.
Pops up on the chart.
But there's a pocket of them that live in this nice little subdivision that get to go to Grays Lake High School.
Is it because the boundary was redrawn around them like that?
Yes, and I live in a district that's similar to that, where I went to a very underfunded middle school, but because of the district lines, my high school was different, so I was going to school with people who were way above where my income was. And it's like, what can we do about people like me who are just like stuck in that pocket?
Well, that's the Milliken problem. That's that district. When I talk about Milliken v. Bradley, I talk about the fact that the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in the 1970s that federal district judges could not enforce an inter-district solution, that there somehow was some purity to district boundaries that should not or could not be disrupted through judicial intervention, right? And that really undermines so much. And the interest